I used to think I was emotionally intelligent, empathetic, self-aware, good at managing conflict. But one night during a sociology class, a single question shattered everything. What if your emotional intelligence is just society rewarding obedience? Since then, I've questioned every reaction, every skill I thought was mine. Maybe I wasn't emotionally smart. Maybe I was just well-trained to fit in. I had just mediated another workplace conflict when my manager patted me on the back and said, "You're so emotionally intelligent. You keep everything smooth around here." I smiled, nodded, and said thank you, like always. But something about the word smooth stuck in my head. It felt less like a compliment and more like a label. Smooth, as in quiet, predictable, safe. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment in my head. I've always taken pride in my emotional intelligence, being able to read people, de-escalate tension, stay calm under pressure. But suddenly I wondered, am I truly skilled at navigating emotions, or just trained to avoid making others uncomfortable? That question led me down a rabbit hole I wasn't prepared for. I started reading more about emotional intelligence, but this time through a sociological lens. One article in particular hit me hard. It described emotional intelligence as a cultural performance, often rewarded not because it's morally good, but because it maintains social order. The writer argued that being emotionally intelligent in many workplaces means keeping others comfortable, especially those in power. I paused reading that line over and over, keeping others comfortable. I thought back to every time I stayed silent in a meeting when someone said something subtly offensive. Every time I absorbed someone else's frustration without expressing my own. Every time I managed emotions by hiding mine. Was that emotional maturity or fear of being disruptive? And then I remembered my mother. She used to tell me, "Control your face. People are always watching." She didn't mean it as manipulation. She meant it as survival. For her, a black woman in a white corporate world, emotional control wasn't a self-help technique. It was a shield. It wasn't about inner peace. It was about outer safety. And maybe I had inherited that more than I realized. I used to think emotional intelligence was internal, a quiet superpower, but now it looked more like a performance I'd been trained to perfect, like smiling when I'm uncomfortable, nodding when I disagree, listening without pushing back, all to be professional, all to be accepted. The more I thought about it, the more the praise I'd received over the years felt less like acknowledgement and more like control. People love emotional intelligence when it keeps things peaceful. But what happens when emotional intelligence confronts injustice? When it speaks uncomfortable truths? Suddenly you're too intense, too emotional, not a team player. I remembered a former colleague, Jordan, who once called out our department head for micromanaging women more than men. Jordan wasn't rude, just direct, honest, emotional, yes, but grounded. The backlash was immediate. She was labeled difficult, sensitive, even hostile. I never defended her. I didn't say a word. I told myself it wasn't my fight. But the truth? I was afraid. Afraid I'd lose my emotionally intelligent badge. Afraid I'd stop being seen as safe. That night I sat in the dark, wondering what emotional intelligence really meant to me. Was it about connection, courage, truth, or had it become a cage I mistook for a gift? I realized I had spent years perfecting the art of emotional restraint, not for myself, but for others, for systems, for norms I didn't choose. That's when I made a decision. From that moment on, I would no longer call myself emotionally intelligent if it only meant keeping the peace. I wanted my emotional awareness to mean something deeper, to reflect authenticity, not just adaptability, even if it made people uncomfortable, especially if it did. When I started thinking more critically about emotional intelligence, I began to notice something eerie. I'd been wearing a mask, not the kind you put on deliberately, but the kind you're handed so early you forget you're even wearing it. I was always the calm one, the mediator, the friend who could listen to someone vent for hours and say just the right thing to soothe them. People would say, "You're such a rock." And I would smile, but inside I was crumbling. I didn't know how to ask for help. I barely knew how to cry anymore. My emotions had become tools, controlled, measured, repackaged for the comfort of others. I remember one evening when a friend called me in tears. She'd had a fight with her partner, and she needed someone to talk to. I listened for 2 hours. I gave her advice. I validated her pain. When we hung up, I felt proud, useful even, but then I stared at the wall for 15 minutes, completely numb. I hadn't told her I'd had a panic attack the day before. I hadn't said I was barely sleeping. It hadn't felt relevant or safe. Was that emotional intelligence or just self-erasure? The more I reflected, the more I noticed a pattern. I was emotionally intelligent in public, but emotionally avoidant in private. I knew how to make you feel seen, heard, understood, but me, I had no idea how to let anyone see the parts of me that didn't look polished. Sociology calls this emotional labor, the invisible, unpaid work of managing not just your emotions, but the emotions of others. And it's disproportionately expected from certain groups, especially women, people of color, service workers, caregivers. We're told that our ability to keep things together is a strength, but no one asks what it costs us. At work, I'd sit in meetings absorbing passive-aggressive remarks, microaggressions, and unrealistic demands. I'd nod, breathe, smile. "Let's find a solution," I'd say, even when I wanted to scream. My reward? Respect, promotions, a reputation for grace under pressure. But I started to resent it, because grace under pressure is only noble when it's a choice, not when it's survival. I began journaling at night, trying to map the moments I performed emotional intelligence versus when I actually felt emotionally aligned. The gap was huge. I realized I was living a double emotional life: public calm, private chaos, social awareness on the outside, internal neglect on the inside. One night I wrote a sentence in my journal that scared me. "I don't know who I am when no one needs me to be something." That's when it clicked. My emotional intelligence had never been neutral. It had been shaped, molded, and reinforced by society, by gender roles, by racial stereotypes, by corporate cultures that praise emotional resilience but punish emotional truth. I was praised for staying calm when I should have been angry. I was rewarded for biting my tongue instead of standing my ground. I was labeled mature when I was just exhausted. And the more I complied, the harder it became to access my real emotions. They were buried under years of social training, so I decided to try something radical: emotional honesty. The next time a friend asked how I was doing, I didn't say, "I'm good." I said, "I'm overwhelmed, actually." It landed like a small earthquake. She blinked, then leaned in and said, "Tell me more." I almost cried. It was the first time I felt emotionally intelligent and emotionally free. That mask I'd been wearing, I started to loosen the straps. Not all at once, but enough to breathe. It hit me during a training session at work. We were in one of those mandatory professional development workshops, the kind with slides about communication styles and emotional maturity. The facilitator smiled as she explained how true leaders stay composed, even when provoked. She clicked to the next slide. "Don't react. Respond." Everyone nodded. I did too, but something inside me twisted. I used to live by that mantra. Don't react. Respond. Stay in control. But now I was asking myself, respond to what? And according to whom? The facilitator gave an example. "If a colleague says something offensive in a meeting," she said, "a high EQ individual might redirect the conversation calmly or take the person aside later. But reacting emotionally in the moment, well, that's unprofessional." I felt my stomach clench because I'd been that high EQ individual too many times. I'd swallowed outrage to stay composed. I'd smiled through belittling comments. I'd said things like, "Let's take this offline," when what I really meant was, "What you just said is harmful and wrong." I looked around the room, watching people scribble notes, nod politely, and it hit me like a punch. We weren't being trained to understand emotions. We were being trained to manage them in ways that protect structures, not people. Emotional intelligence in this context wasn't about growth or authenticity. It was about compliance. That realization made me dizzy. Because here's the thing, I'm all for emotional awareness. I believe in reflection, empathy, pausing before reacting. But what happens when your so-called emotional intelligence is used as a tool to silence yourself, to maintain peace at the expense of truth? That's not emotional growth. That's obedience dressed up as maturity. And the more I thought about it, the more examples came rushing back. Moments when I'd told myself, be the bigger person, when what I really meant was, don't make waves. Times I'd complimented someone who just undercut me in front of the whole room. Instances where I'd left conversations feeling heavy, because I had buried my real emotions under the mask of being emotionally intelligent. I realized I had internalized the belief that calm equals correct, that if I got angry, I lost, that raising my voice made me less credible. But who decided that? And more importantly, who benefits when people like me stay quiet? Sociology teaches us that emotions are not just personal, they're political. What we're allowed to feel and how we're allowed to express it is shaped by culture, power, and expectation. Anger, for example, is seen as a strength in some bodies and a threat in others. When a man yells, he's passionate. When I do, I'm unhinged. So I started to see the EQ model differently. Instead of asking, am I emotionally intelligent? I began asking, whose emotional comfort am I protecting with my behavior? That question changed everything, because sometimes the most emotionally intelligent thing you can do is get angry. Sometimes emotional honesty requires tears, trembling hands, raised voices. Sometimes being real means being raw and risking the labels that come with it. After that training session, I walked back to my desk and opened a blank document. At the top, I typed, I will no longer shrink myself to fit someone else's idea of control. I made a vow that day I wouldn't perform emotional intelligence to be seen as good. I would practice it in a way that honors my truth, even when it's messy, even when it makes people uncomfortable. Because emotional intelligence should liberate us, not domesticate us. And if it doesn't include room for righteous anger, vulnerability, or dissent, then maybe it's not intelligence at all. Maybe it's just fear. It was during a leadership retreat. You know the kind. Awkward icebreakers, catered lunch, small talk pretending to be transformation. We were seated in a circle talking about difficult conversations. The facilitator asked a simple question. When was the last time you didn't speak your truth at work? The room went silent. I felt a lump rising in my throat. My instinct was to stay quiet, to play my role, be the thoughtful one, the listener, the peacemaker. But something inside me cracked open. Maybe it was all the nights I journaled about hiding myself. Maybe it was exhaustion, but I raised my hand. I do it all the time, I said. Every week, maybe every day, because I've been trained to believe that my truth is only welcome if it's palatable. Heads turned. I wasn't trying to be confrontational, but I wasn't sugarcoating either. When I speak up and I'm calm, I'm respected. But if I show anger, even when it's justified, the tone police show up. If I get emotional, I lose credibility. So I filter myself constantly. People looked uncomfortable. A few nodded. The facilitator blinked and said, "That's powerful. Thank you for your honesty." But I could feel the energy shift. I had broken the script, and it felt terrifying and freeing. After the session, one colleague pulled me aside and whispered, "I feel the same way," but I'd never say it out loud. That's when I realized just how deep this emotional training runs. We're not just taught to manage emotions. We're taught to perform them in ways that won't disrupt the hierarchy. Being emotionally intelligent had turned into being emotionally compliant. I used to think silence was strength. Now I see how silence can be survival. Or worse, submission. That retreat became a turning point. I stopped trying to be the person who always says the right thing. I started saying the real thing. It wasn't always pretty, like when a colleague made a joke that wasn't overtly offensive, but definitely rooted in bias. Normally, I would have smiled awkwardly and let it slide, but that day I said, "That actually doesn't sit right with me. Can we talk about why?" The room froze. Someone laughed nervously, but we talked. It was tense, yes, but honest. And afterward, someone said to me, "I never thought about it like that. Thanks for saying something." It wasn't about being confrontational. It was about alignment. I didn't want to just look emotionally intelligent. I wanted to feel emotionally free. And freedom, I've learned, requires disruption. It requires questioning the scripts you've memorized. It means asking hard questions. Who benefits from my silence? Who taught me that calmness is better than courage? Who told me that professionalism means smiling while my soul screams? Because emotional intelligence shouldn't just help us fit in, it should help us show up. I started redefining what EQ meant to me. Not compliance, not control, but courage to speak, even if my voice shakes. Empathy that doesn't enable harm, boundaries without guilt, anger that signals injustice, not immaturity, vulnerability that connects, not weakens. I stopped seeing emotional intelligence as a prize to earn and started seeing it as a compass, not for how to act, but for how to live truthfully. And I finally understood. If your emotional intelligence makes you invisible, it's not intelligence, it's erasure. A few weeks ago, I ran into someone from that leadership retreat. We sat down for coffee and she said, "You've been on my mind. What you said changed how I think about emotional intelligence." I smiled, but inside I was still grappling with what that term really means for me. The journey I've been on didn't start with theory. It started with unease, with that moment after my manager called me emotionally intelligent, and I didn't know whether to be proud or ashamed. Since then, I've had to unlearn a lot. I had to unlearn that staying calm in the face of harm is a virtue. I had to unlearn that emotions make me less credible. I had to unlearn that peace is always better than disruption. I had to unlearn that being understood was more important than being honest. And once I started unlearning, I could finally ask, what do I want emotional intelligence to be? Because here's the truth. No one tells you. Most people's idea of emotional intelligence is designed for comfort, not growth. It's curated for boardrooms, for customer service, for conflict avoidance. It's praised when it makes you agreeable, but punished when it makes you authentic. But I've started to believe something radical. Real emotional intelligence is about alignment, not alignment with rules or expectations, but with yourself. It's the courage to feel fully, to speak clearly, to choose discomfort when it leads to honesty. It's saying, "I'm not okay with this," even when it might cost you social capital. It's letting your tears fall in front of someone who's never seen you cry. It's owning your joy, joy without apology, your rage without shame, your truth without dilution. These days, I don't try to manage emotions to maintain order. I manage them to maintain integrity. And ironically, that makes me more connected, not less. People sense when you're real. They lean in when they feel your sincerity. When I dropped the mask, something wild happened. Others started taking off theirs, too. Friends opened up more. Colleagues asked deeper questions. Strangers told me their stories. I used to think emotional intelligence meant being less reactive, less intense, less expressive. Now I know it means being more aware, more grounded, more you. Yes, it's still hard sometimes. My instinct to smooth things over hasn't disappeared overnight, but I no longer see that instinct as wisdom. I see it as habit, and habits can be rewritten. Now, when I'm praised for being emotionally mature, I pause. I ask myself, do they mean I'm being true, or just that I'm being quiet? If it's the latter, I reconsider whether that's a compliment I even want, because I no longer aspire to be palatable. I aspire to be present. I aspire to be emotionally awake, not emotionally agreeable. So the next time someone asks me, "Are you emotionally intelligent?" I'll ask them right back, "Do you mean by your definition or mine?" Emotional intelligence isn't about fitting into someone else's mold. It's about breaking free from it. If this story challenged how you see yourself or the world around you, good. That's where growth begins. Now it's your turn. Are you truly emotionally intelligent or just socially trained? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I dare you to be honest.